Some places on Earth, they just don't play by the rules. They're wrapped up in these wild stories, steeped in some kind of tragedy, or built for a reason we just can't figure out anymore. And they pull us in. They dare us to find an answer, even when it feels totally impossible. So let's dive right into some of the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries, starting with the ones born from folklore and pure fear. I mean, that's really the big question, right? Whether it's the whisper of a ghost or a pile of ancient bones, these places challenge everything we think we know about history, about science, about reality itself. And we're going to explore that very question by looking at how our tools for finding answers, from old school legends to cutting-edge physics, actually shape what we end up discovering. Okay, so first up, we're going to get a little spooky. We're heading into the realm of the supernatural, visiting places where the stories and the fear have just kind of taken over. And that line between what's real and what's just a story, yeah, it gets really blurry. All right, so our first stop is near a place called Cluj-Napoca in Romania. And on the surface, you look at it and think, wow, what a gorgeous forest. But for decades, they've literally called it Romania's Bermuda Triangle, a place where strange things happen and people, well, they sometimes just disappear. Get this, its name actually comes from a shepherd who, according to legend, vanished in there with his entire flock of 200 sheep. The place really blew up on the world stage back in 1968 after a military technician snapped a photo of a classic flying saucer right there. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're talking ghostly figures, electronics just dying for no reason, and visitors leaving feeling sick or even with these bizarre, unexplained scratches. And maybe the weirdest part of all? There's this perfectly circular clearing in the middle of the forest where, for centuries, nothing, absolutely nothing, will grow. How crazy is that? But this kind of creepy stuff isn't just out in some spooky forest in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes it follows you right into your own house, into the places you're supposed to feel the safest. This next one is about a family in Pakistan. They move into this government house that's been empty for over 20 years. And yeah, they found out pretty quick they weren't alone. And this story is a wild example of how things can go from 0 to 100 real fast. At first, it was just weird things, like these strange blood-like splatters showing up on the floor. So they bring in a spiritual healer who confirms their worst fears. A family of jinn, or supernatural beings, were living there. But then came the turning point. Late one night, the oldest brother is just playing video games, and all of a sudden, he starts laughing, just uncontrollably, staring right at his younger brother. It was clear he was possessed. They had to rush him in the middle of the night back to the healer for a full-on exorcism to get this thing out of him. Okay, so we've talked about stories and legends, but what happens when the mystery is right there in front of you, written in actual physical evidence? We're going to switch gears now from folklore to forensics. We're talking about puzzles written in human bone, where science has to step in and play detective. For this next one, we have to go way, way up. I'm talking high in the Indian Himalayas, a spot that's almost impossible to get to. Think about it, over 16,000 feet up. And up there, there's this remote frozen lake. They call this place Rupkund, or more famously, Skeleton Lake, because every single year when the ice melts for just a little while, hundreds, and I mean hundreds of human skeletons just appear, coming up from the water all along the shore. And for years, the question was pretty straightforward. Who are these people? And what in the world happened to them all up here? So the local story was pretty epic. It said a king and his whole crew got on the wrong side of a goddess and were wiped out by a giant hailstorm way back in the 9th century. And hey, some of the skulls had fractures, so it kind of made sense. But then modern science comes in, and the DNA analysis just completely flips the script. It wasn't one group of people, it was 2 different groups that died in 2 separate events 1,000 years apart. And here's the real shocker. One of the groups wasn't even from South Asia. Their DNA pointed straight to the Eastern Mediterranean. We're talking modern-day Greece and Crete. And they died as recently as 1800 CE. So how did a bunch of Europeans end up dead at a remote lake in the Himalayas 1,000 years after the first group? The science didn't solve the mystery. It made it 100 times weirder. And this idea of skeletons telling a totally different story than the one we've been told, well, that brings us to our next spot. We're going to one of the world's very first big cities, Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. So when the first archaeologists found over 40 skeletons just lying in the streets, They jumped to a pretty dramatic conclusion: a brutal massacre. Invaders came in, wiped everyone out, and that was the end of the Indus Valley civilization. That story was told for decades. But just like with Skeleton Lake, when scientists actually looked closer at the evidence, the story fell apart. There were no wounds from weapons on the bones, no signs of a big battle, and the radiocarbon dating, well, it showed these people didn't all die at once. Their deaths were spread out over 1,000 years. Yeah, one archaeologist, a Dr. Dales, pretty much nailed it when he asked, where's the evidence? Where are the weapons, the arrowheads, the armor? You can't have a massacre without a battle. And at Mohenjo-Daro, there was just nothing. The whole massacre theory, just a myth. And the real reason they died? Well, that's a much quieter and much more complicated mystery. So, we've seen how science can totally debunk an old story. Now for our last section, let's look at how brand new tech is letting us peek inside mysteries that until now were completely locked away. And you really can't get any bigger or more mysterious than this one, the Great Pyramid of Giza. For 4,500 years, it's been holding on to its secrets. Sure, we've known about the main rooms for a long time, but there's always been this feeling, this suspicion, that there was something more hidden inside. And guess what? We were right. And how they found it is just mind-blowing. They used something called cosmic ray muons, basically particles that rain down from space, to scan the pyramid. It let them see through solid rock without making a single mark. And boom, they found a huge empty space inside, a hidden corridor almost 100 feet long. So what do? You send in a tiny robot. They sent it down this narrow passage and it kept going until it ran right into a sealed stone door. And the lead Egyptologist on this, the famous Dr. Zahi Hawass, he's totally convinced this isn't just some random structural thing. He thinks this corridor could lead to the real burial chamber of King Khufu, the one nobody has ever found. Just think about that. The answer to one of the biggest secrets in history could be waiting right on the other side of that door. Wow, so we've gone from haunted forests and lakes full of skeletons all the way to secret corridors in the Great Pyramid. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, it's pretty clear our tools have changed, right? I mean, we've gone from telling stories and listening to spiritual healers all the way to using DNA sequencing and scanning with cosmic rays. But the tools change, the tech gets better, and our basic human drive to figure this stuff out, that never changes. That need to understand the unknown, it's just part of who we are. And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. As we chase down the facts, whether it's with a DNA test or a space particle scanner, sometimes we solve one mystery only to find an even bigger, stranger one hiding right behind it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. Maybe these places are here to remind us that the story itself, that unending search for the answer, is just as important, maybe even more important than the answer we're looking for.